Hello and welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott. This is program number 1, and what's going to turn out to be a very long series, could be as long as 2 years. We're going to be looking at the book of Acts, and this program is going to focus on part 1 of an introduction. There's a lot of things that we need to understand about the books, who wrote them, when were they written, and other details of that nature. And so that's how we're going to be proceeding all along. We're going to look at the introduction. If you were to go to a Bible college or a seminary and you're going to study a book, you'd have to go through all of this because it makes a great deal of difference in how many of the passages are interpreted. So we're going to be looking at the book of Acts. It's the 5th book in the New Testament. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then Acts. And Acts is the longest in terms of numbers of words of all of the books of the New Testament. And the writer, we think, is a man by the name of Luke. And in the language of the day, a Latin name likely was Lucas, but we know him as Luke. And Lucas, like George Lucas of film fame, the name means light giving. Oh, it was a very interesting name. Now, what do we know about this guy, Luke, and how did he get attached to the book? Because the original documents, they don't have Acts on it. They don't have any title. The book has no title, and it doesn't have an author either. Same with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why that is so, that we don't find the early on the name of the book and the author, the style, perhaps. Nobody knows. But we do know that in about 170, AD 170, Luke began to be attached to the document as the author, and a name was given, Acts, and later on Acts of the Apostles. In early about 180 AD, a document called the Anti-Marcionite document mentions that it is by Luke and is called Acts. Also, that document says that Luke was originated from Antioch of Syria. Then in a little bit earlier, 10 years earlier, about AD 170, in a document called the Muratorian Canon or the Muratorian Fragment, although it is missing the first page of the Acts account, but it does call the book Acts and accredits it to Luke. Tertullian, writing in about 200 AD, and Irenaeus, a little earlier, 170, and Clement of Alexandria in at about the same time, plus Origen, these early Christian writers all attributed the document we call Acts to Luke, and they call it Acts, and usually of the Apostles. Eusebius, writing in the early 4th century, and also Jerome, the author of the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Old Testament and New Testament, ascribes it both to Acts and the author Luke. So a little bit about Luke. Who's Luke? Paul in Colossians 1:14 refers to him as the beloved physician. In 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul writes, Luke alone is with me. Very interesting. Luke alone is with me. Now, 2 Timothy, very likely the last letter Paul wrote, just sometime short of his execution in and around 65, 66 AD. Luke is there. He's with Paul at that point. Philemon 24 refers to Luke as fellow worker. Paul calls Luke a fellow worker. We don't know if Luke was a proselyte to Judaism. We know he was a Gentile. He is the only Gentile writer of the Bible. A Gentile. Now, there were many Gentiles who would be attracted to Judaism, and they would be of two different classes. One would be the proselyte. That means they would fully become identified as Jewish. They would be circumcised, and they would keep kosher. They would observe the laws of Moses, and as I said, they would be considered Jewish at that point. Another designation is God-fearer. We think of Cornelius of Caesarea, story we'll get to in a few months. He was a God-fearer. A Gentile, did not convert to Judaism, but he was attracted to the monotheism of Judaism, and so would be acquainted with Judaism. So we think that Luke was a Gentile. Don't know if he was a proselyte. Don't know if he was a God-fearer. Some people speculate that Luke was converted under the ministry of the Apostle Paul at some point. But these sort of things are just guessings. We don't really know. That he was a physician is quite clear. In the ancient universities at the time, Alexandria, Rome, Tarsus. Tarsus, by the way, was a great university, and that's where Paul grew up. And medicine was one of the major courses of study. When you read through the Gospel of Luke and you read through the book of Acts, you'll find a number of medically oriented terms, terms that aren't found in other places in the New Testament. And it gives us a little indication of the background that Luke had. And of course, Paul referred to Luke as the beloved physician. So he grew, so we know that he was educated professionally in a real university. He probably had some wealth. Some suggest that he had a patron, and the patron may be a man by the name of Theophilus. This is a view which I don't hold to, but it's one of those, because it appears that Luke was unmarried. He never had any children. We have no information on that, but it's absent, and we think probably unmarried, and that he was a reliable historian. Luke had been in decades past accused of a number of inaccuracies in his account, particularly in the book of Acts. Subsequent archaeology and other research has found entirely the opposite. I was incredibly accurate, getting exactly right dates, the names of government officials, and the comings and goings of these officials. They are spot on, as research has shown. So he was a reliable historian. And his Greek is the best Greek in the New Testament. And it's even better than that. There are some 28 speeches that are given in the book of Acts. Many by Paul, there's by Peter, there's a number of them. And these writers are different in orientation. For example, Stephen, who was one of the 7 deacons, when you look at how their speeches or sermons are given in the book of Acts, you see that they are nuanced. Stephen speaks like a Jewish person of his day. Paul, very clear. Peter, the Galilean, nuanced. The various speakers, Cornelius, for example, again, the Roman centurion, what his relay of what he says is perfectly typical of the kind of person he was. So Luke was not just writing blindly and putting everything down. He carefully researched. We know that Luke at least twice spent time in Jerusalem with Paul, and he would have had plenty of opportunity to talk to the apostles. We know that the account of the birth of Jesus, the story of the Virgin Mary, are so carefully laid out in Luke, and it is very likely that he had opportunity to actually spend time with Mary, the mother of Jesus. So we find this very careful writing in the book of Acts. It's very interesting to read. Now, let's talk a little bit about the date of Acts. When was Acts written? Two dates are generally given, a span of between 62 and 64 AD. And let me give you some of the reasons for these ideas. One, in the book of Acts, the destruction of Jerusalem, or the civil war that existed, that began in 66, is not at all mentioned in the book of Acts. The problems began in about 66, and 4 years later in 70, the Romans under Titus, they destroyed the temple and much of the city of Jerusalem. There's nothing of that in the book of Acts. And even before that, we have no indication of a Roman Empire persecution of Christians, which really didn't begin until Nero in AD 64. So that's why the limits are like 62 to 64. About a generation after the crucifixion, resurrection, ascension of Jesus, which, due to our calendar mix-up, took place at right around AD 30. So between 32 and 34 years after the core events, the book of Acts is written. And again, that date 64 is pretty good because Luke does not mention any kind of persecution by the Roman Empire in Acts, which did definitely start in 64 when Nero blamed the Christians for burning Rome down. The volume that we have, Acts, is a volume. It's volume 2. Volume 1 is the book, is the gospel. So the gospel, then you got Acts. There's some indication when you get to the book of Acts, and we won't look at that for about a year and a half or a year and 3/4, that the book of Acts ends fairly abruptly. It doesn't have that nice finished conclusion that you might expect. And so we don't know exactly what happened. It could have been that Luke was preparing to write a third volume, or something happened to Luke. We just don't know what happened. Part of the notions about Luke was that he lived a fairly long time, that he did not die until he was 84 years old. These are traditional kinds of ideas, and they are not that clearly substantiated, but we throw that out. So volume 2, or Acts, ends with Paul getting to Rome. The Gospel of Luke ends with the ascension, and Acts begins with the ascension. So Acts takes us from, again, the ascension to Paul getting to Rome, which is very significant. So it is thought that probably Luke wrote both the Gospel and Acts while he was with Paul in house arrest in Rome. The first incarceration of Paul took place about 62, lasted about 2 years. It was a house arrest only. He wasn't in chains at that point. He was able to have people with him. He paid for an attendant to be with him. And Luke, it looks like very clearly, was present with him. And it's likely that Paul was released and was able to go on his last missionary journey. He said he wanted to go to Spain. It's probable that he did. The reason I'm saying this is because when you look at 1st and 2nd Timothy, you find Paul talking about things that are not recorded in the book of Acts. They're not there, not in the book of Acts. When did Paul do these things? Well, it would have been after his release. The book of Acts comes to a conclusion. Paul goes off, comes back later, this time in real trouble with Rome, and is finally executed sometime 65, 66. We don't have rock-solid evidence for all of this, but these things that I've been saying are generally the conclusions that most scholars have come to. I'm just repeating them. Now, when we talk about acts, whose acts are these? Who's acting? It says acts, and later on it was actually the apostles, but apparently Luke put no title of the book on this document we're looking at. So it came to be called Acts, but we have to ask the question, who's Acts? Who's the one that's doing all of this acting? Well, let me give you the possibilities that people have come up with. One is, of course, Acts of the Apostles. This is the most ancient of the titles given to it. But when you look at it, only Peter, Paul are covered to any degree, and a little bit of John, the Apostle John. So Acts of the Apostles, okay, maybe. Another suggestion is Acts of the Holy Spirit. Now, this is probably the second most common one. In the book of Acts are 4, historians, Bible scholars say 4 Pentecosts. I say there are 5. I count 5, but 4 are given in the book of Acts. These are times of major outpourings of the Holy Spirit. Numbers of people are converted. It's the work of the Holy Spirit in doing the work of conversion. There was, of course, the Jerusalem Pentecost, the Samaritan, Caesarean, and Ephesian Pentecost, those 4. And when we get to it, I'll present a 5th. And then a third idea is that it was the Acts of the early church, or the Acts of the early Christians. That could be too. That period essentially between about AD 30 and 62, 63, 64. But really, it was only a small part of the church. The church that Luke writes of is only a small part of that church. And then another idea is it's the acts of Jesus himself. It's all that Jesus said and did. That's what Acts 1:1 starts with, I think. And so it says in the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all those Jesus began to do and teach. He began to do and teach. So you could say Acts is really the story of Jesus involving a few of the key players. So there may be some other ideas. By the way, the word Acts as a title of a book was not uncommon in that period. In fact, one of the histories of Alexander the Great and also of the Persian King Cyrus, they were also called Acts. So it was a title that was written to. Now, I'm going to ask one last question, and then we're going to look at some of the verses at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. And here's the question, who is Acts written to? Who is the book of Luke written to? Both in the early part named somebody by the name of Theophilus. Theophilus. Now, if you break the word down, Theo is the Greek word for God. Theo, God. the Latin rendering of Theo is Deo, D-E-O. And then the other part of the word, Philos. Philos is from the Greek word that means friend. So you could say it is written to the friend of God. Now, there is a title given to this man in the Gospel of Luke, and it says, Excellent Theophilus. Excellent was a term that could be applied to Roman officials, referred to the excellent Felix, excellent Festus, the excellent Pilate. It was an honorific title that Rome used. But then again, that's not for sure going to make the case for one individual being written to. My own view, and it's a minority opinion, is that it is written to all of us. It is written to all of us who are followers of Jesus. We are friends of God. And that's who I think Theophilus is. It's us. It's all the Christians down through the centuries who have loved to read and study the book of Acts. So, again, like I like to say, please feel free to disagree with me. These are just ideas that we have. I must say that my favorite commentators, Craig Evans, William Hendrickson, Simon Kistemaker, F.F. Bruce, they mostly agree that it is an individual that he's actually writing to. A Roman official, a patron, somebody that he knew, we don't know. But anyway, as Christians, we are free to disagree with each other. We do not engage in groupthink. I just reread Brave New World by Aldous Huxley and George Orwell's 1984. I was particularly looking at the concept of groupthink and how authoritarian governments and groups want everybody to think alike. And that's not how it is with Christians. People will look at Christianity and think, boy, they're very divided and have different ideas. And I say that's good. That's a good and a healthy thing. It would not be good if everybody agreed on every little point. Okay, that's my little soapbox for this program. Now, let's take a look. We're going to take a look at the first 4 verses of the Gospel of Luke because it's the initial introduction to this 2-volume set. Next week, we're going to look at the first verses, the introductory verses of Acts. But here, let's take a look at what we have in the Gospel of Luke, verses 1 to 4. He says, Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Now, that is curious because we're really not aware of a lot of different accounts, written accounts, of the story of Jesus. We have an idea, although we don't have the document. There is a document that would be called Q or Quelle, a German word that means source. It is thought that there was a primitive gospel account of the life of Jesus that existed at the time when Matthew, Mark, Luke, the early synoptics were written. That's possible. There's some significant evidence based upon discoveries of the fragments of Gospel of Mark found amongst Dead Sea Scroll material. I think it was Cave 4 or Cave 7, I can't remember which, that Mark might have been written as early as AD 49. Can't prove that, but this is beginning to take on a little bit of substance now. So we don't know if maybe Luke is thinking about Mark, whether maybe he's thinking about Quelle, the Q document, don't know. There's another probable document that was written early by Christians with a list of passages in the Old Testament, prophetic passages, that the early church researched and said this applies to Jesus. So we don't know. But the word many and all in the New Testament, you have to be very careful with those words because they can have a wide range of meaning. Anyway, so Luke says, I'm going to do this. A lot of people have done it. I'm going to do it. He says, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Now, they were eyewitnesses going back to the days of John the Baptist, all the way back. John the Baptist, and he said eyewitnesses, eyewitness accounts, and ministers, they were servants. The word minister means to serve or to work. Ministers of the word, that is the word of Christ, the word of Jesus himself, have delivered to us. So he's saying there are tangible eyewitness accounts that I'm drawing from here. He's researched, he's talked with these people, and he says, have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also. Maybe that's Luke's way of talking about inspiration, that God had worked on him to the point that he said, we need an account. And I haven't imagined that Paul would have been perhaps pressing Luke for an account, because Luke being a Gentile, who better to write to a Gentile audience, the Gentiles that Paul and Luke had been sent to minister to. So it would make sense for a Greek speaker and with the Greek culture to write a document, the story of Jesus. So it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Wow. That you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So there we go. Here we have the educated, great historian Luke, who has talked to the eyewitnesses, and for very important reasons of mission and evangelism to support his ministry with Paul, would write both the gospel and later on the account of Acts. And one of the reasons why Acts is so very important is because Acts, when it was published, made Paul famous, and is one of the major reasons why all the letters of Paul were collected by the churches. Okay, I'll be mentioning that a couple more times as we go along. Until next time, so long.